Thank you so much, Yasmina Allouche, for joining us for this special GBV series focused on online harassment. Before we get into specifically online harassment as a form of gender-based violence, I wanted you to just, from your perspective and the research that you're doing and the work that you're focused on, just sort of define how gender-based violence is seen and perceived and understood in the MENA region.
Okay, so gender-based violence is violence that is considered to be any harmful act acts that are directed against individuals or groups solely on the basis of their gender. And now this pretty much is a definition that works the world over, regardless of if you're from the MENA region or not. And these violent acts range from sexual violence, domestic violence, forced or early marriages, trafficking, or harmful traditional practices. And it's pretty much, as we know, quite prevalent in the MENA region, as it is, of course, across globally. So in recent years, even though women's rights defenders across the region have won important battles that have brought about limited advances in women's rights, for example, if we look at a 2017 landmark law in Tunisia that was brought about to protect women from all forms of gender-based violence, where the region is, where progress is being hindered in the region is the fact that it's being overshadowed by governments that are simply not taking the issue of gender-based violence seriously. And it, as we often unfortunately see, has devastating consequences for women globally. And unfortunately, we do see many cases across the MENA where government or authorities' negligence has proven extremely consequential, and the end results have been quite tragic.
And we've seen this particularly during the pandemic, that it was also a pandemic of gender-based violence. There have been multiple reports about the surge in cases, those who were reported, but also those that weren't reported. So that's absolutely unfortunate. Exactly. I think one element that I'd like us to discuss today is online harassment as a form of gender-based violence. And you've given us, the broad definition. As you said, it applies worldwide, including in the Middle East or North Africa region. Do you think there is awareness in the MENA region that online harassment is a form of GBV?
So I think there is awareness of women in the region of how, for example, their online activities are being singled out for surveillance, and how consequential what they do online proves. For example, if you compose that with their male counterparts who have not been subjected to the same degree, and it just basically adds to the deepening digital divide between men and women. So if you look at, for example, a report in 2018 by the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media, 1/3 of young women who were surveyed said that they had been subjected to violence and harassment online, including having their accounts hacked, their personal details published, or receiving inappropriate pictures. And 1 in 4 of those attacked online or who faced some sort of harassment online were forced to close their media accounts. And then around 43% said that they actively engage in self-censorship. So this is a major thing that's happening. And there is awareness of, what constitutes as online harassment, what constitutes as online abuse. And this is all obviously adding to the worsening risk to their well-being online, which, obviously many women escape to avoid their day-to-day lives, which unfortunately is often fraught with violence in some cases, and whether that's physical, emotional, or even spiritual abuse. So the issue is that many see it as parts and parcel of their lives, and while so many fail to report, for example, physical accounts of violence, it is even less likely that they will report the harassment that they face online or the abuse they face. And then unfortunately, we've seen this in, over the year, whether it's murdered MPs in Libya, murdered lawyers in Kuwait, or TV presenters in Algeria that were killed. And you know, they were either raising awareness around their cases, and the authorities simply just did not respond adequately to the threats that they were facing. And unfortunately, what happens is you have a case that will be ignited nationally. It will send shockwaves. You'll find protests of women who are frustrated and angry at the fact that their well-being and safety is not being taken seriously. And then unfortunately, authorities promise changes, they promise reforms, but then what we see is very, very little is actually actualized. And that's where the main crux of the problem is in the MENA region.
So why do you think that promises are made by governments every time there's, as you said, basically one big crisis or one big case, and then we don't see any progress? Like, what will it take for governments to move forward with stronger legislation and also implementation of this legislation? First of all, where are we at in terms of anti-online harassment legislation? Does that even exist in the MENA region?
So if you look at, for example, Tunisia, as I mentioned before, in 2017, there was a law that was passed that basically criminalized all forms of violence against women, and it actually included prosecuting online abuse and harassment. But the issue is that the court cases since this admission has actually been quite few. And if you look at, for example, neighboring in Morocco in 2019, only 1 in 10 Moroccan women reported online gender-based violence to authorities. And this is despite the fact that Morocco's government passed a law where also harassment was criminalized and violence against women was criminalized in 2018. However, many women's rights organizations see legislation such as that passed in Morocco and Tunisia as inadequate in ensuring the protection of assault victims. And the issue, I think, around is many of these laws against harassment or against abuse exist. However, if authorities are not acting on those laws, or there are not significant amounts of cases which deter potential perpetrators from abusing, then you're not going to have enough women coming forward and fostering trust in authorities. And the issue is that many women, even when it comes to, for example, to physical violence. So like, as you mentioned, in the pandemic, unfortunately, with the restrictions, what we saw was a massive increase in domestic violence. In Turkey, the femicide cases were phenomenally massive, tragically massive. And the same in Algeria, for example, there was, in the first half of 2021, around 50 women were killed. So this is a tragic increase in violence. However, the true numbers, in order for us to actually, quantify exactly how bad the situation in the MENA is very difficult to do so, because not everyone comes forward to obviously speak, to go to authorities for, to basically speak up, or to have, for them to be protected against, stalkers, abuses at home, in the workplace, on the streets. So governments, like, for example, if you look at Egypt, for example, a UN study estimated that 99% of women in Egypt have been subjected to some form of sexual harassment at some point in their life. Now, that is, obviously a harrowing statistic. And Egypt, for example, criminalized sexual harassment in 2014. But, the main criticism that we have of rights groups in the region is that the laws that are in place are rarely put into action. So governments in the region already don't really have much legal protections for women as it is, and they're lagging behind massively in terms of providing protections for women. And unfortunately, a lot of MENA countries have the lowest number of laws that protect women from domestic violence in the world. And while social media can provide opportunities for women to have a platform, to advocate publicly for the rights, as long as very little is being done to crack down on harassment and abuse, then they are constantly at risk. And the crux of the problem is the failure of states to set measures in place that protect women and criminalize the abusers to prevent the cycle from continuing. So it comes really as no surprise then that digital spaces have become an extension of the daily hostile realities that women face in MENA countries. And much of the abuse that they face online just simply goes unreported.
Yeah, it's a reflection of their, as you said, their day-to-day in real life, offline as well. You've highlighted the importance of legislation and the dearth of necessary legal protections in the region. So that absolutely has to be a priority. But as you also mentioned, in countries like Tunisia, where laws have been put in place, there are still challenges in implementation. So how do you think we can move past just passing laws, but also ensure implementation? Women's groups are very active on that front, but who else needs to be on board?
Okay, so I think the main issue we have in the region is that many women are not actually aware of these existing laws and their rights, and that basically facilitates the culture of them not reporting the abuse, or making the true numbers of abuse online very difficult to ascertain. So more needs to be done to enable the digital spaces that are available, safe spaces online for everyone, particularly when so many spaces online exclude women. There needs to be legal changes that need to be made to the laws that currently sanction and criminalize perfectly normal behavior on part of women. So for example, there was a case, I believe last year, where young Egyptian women were imprisoned or arrested for TikTok videos. Obviously TikTok is one of the main platforms for youngsters in this day and age, and they were simply videos. They were either reflecting their lives, or they were talking about, certain issues that affected them, and they were arrested. Now, why were they arrested? Why were they singled out for special treatment? That's the main issue that we have, is that women in the region often have very different rules that apply to them as opposed to their male counterparts. And social media, as we know, as we saw in the so-called Arab Spring, was an instrumental tool of the people. And what we see now is that a lot of social media spaces have given platforms for advocacy for women, but unfortunately there is so much misogynistic pushback, which often has nothing to do with people pressing for women's rights. So, for example, if we there were, trending hashtags that we saw in the region, Mishaib, which is, there's no shame, or Anazida in Tunisia, which means me too. And in Morocco, there was also a collective by women called Masektesh, which means I will not be silent. And these are brilliant organizations or platforms that raise awareness around, around victim testimonies that we see daily. But we need existing legislation to reflect that sort of momentum by prosecuting individuals regularly, publicizing those cases so that it deters perpetrators from, normalizing harassment, whether out in the streets, in the home, or online. And basically the government needs to step up, make more of an example of convicted individuals, and above all, women need to be heard. They need to be, respected, and they need to be assured that their lives hold weight and their lives hold value, so that when they go to authorities, number one, they have the option to go to authorities to, whenever they have they feel like their lives are at risk, and then they're basically assured that they, necessary steps will be undertaken for them to have whatever it is that they're bringing forth to the authorities that will be, that will basically stop.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as it stands right now, the price of reporting any cases is very, very high, and exactly. As you mentioned, in some very unfortunate cases, they end up with even more severe threats, if not, murder. Exactly. and that is very disconcerting. I want to go back to the digital space for a minute, and online harassment, because of course this is not unfortunately not a phenomenon that is unique to the MENA region. It is a global problem that many women worldwide are facing at varying degrees, of course, including legislators, women in leadership positions across the board. So I want to hear your thoughts about what you think the tech industry's role in all of this. Is this is it worth opening up channels of communication with them to see if they can play a role in basically regulating the space a little bit better, ensuring that the online spaces are not open and free for all sorts of bullying and harassment?
Yes, definitely. I feel like, platforms like Facebook or Instagram and Twitter, they have, been criticized heavily for not often being safe platforms, regardless of gender. And unfortunately, there are, these spaces often become promotions of violence and other forms of harassment. But because, there's a fine line between what constitutes as privacy and what constitutes as public information in terms of users who, use these platforms, there's a difficulty in how they are able to actually protect individuals, the millions of individuals who use these platforms, and whatever way they work with certain governments. For example, if you look at the West, say in America, like with Mark Zuckerberg having to answer to Senate officials, the same cannot really be applied, throughout the whole region. And the issue is that how much, with governments, unfortunately, in the MENA, when it comes to social media and how the internet is regulated, we often hear of stories of censorship, individuals being arrested because of their online content. And, there's, restrictions, banned platforms, certain social media platforms are banned in the region to avoid dissent and whatnot. So we have that side of the scale where social media, doesn't have the freedom that it's trying to promote at the same time. And then you have the issue, of course, of the social media being used as a platform for change, for people to speak when they cannot speak in public. And when the internet is not regulated in that sort of way, like if you look at in the shadows, for example, then it's difficult for safety to be the number one priority, and it's difficult to go to the authorities if they're the ones who are doing behind the censorship. So it's obviously social media giants have the responsibility of ensuring the safety of their users, but unfortunately it does come down to being able to work with authorities and having a relationship where there is a certain openness and an understanding of certain issues that are prevalent in the region. And unfortunately, a lot of authorities will simply just turn a deaf ear to things that they feel is an infringement on their sovereignty or their power.
Yeah, absolutely. And a common thread in our conversation so far is goes back to what governments and the authorities have to do, and their political will. They're having the political will
exactly
to actually move forward with this. And this goes back to other challenges that women face as well in society, whether it's on the economic front or the political front.
Exactly.
So how do we make that case? How do you, as a researcher and someone who's passionate about these issues, and how do women's groups make that case to governments? It's not like these conversations are not happening with the authorities, because they are. This from your networks in the region. Same goes for me and the people that I know they work tirelessly to ensure that they have some time with the authorities to explain the severity of some of these challenges, particularly when it comes to gender-based violence, and especially since the beginning of the pandemic. But what will it take for the authorities to actually move forward with this?
I think that's the golden question when it comes to a lot of things is how can authorities change when it comes to a plethora of issues that define the MENA region, and unfortunately the case as you mentioned, women's rights groups are doing phenomenal work in the region, and they have been successful in applying pressure. So the medium of protest, the medium of online, lobbying their local government representatives and state officials is a tool that is useful. It's a tool that can warrant positive results. But unfortunately, if governments are not best placed to respond to that or to accept that they have a problem, then obviously the solution cannot just be from women's rights organization. It needs to be a community and a national mobilization one. If you look at, for example, a lot of the protest movements that we've seen over the last 2 years, women have played very active roles. Women are, there are many women, female MPs who make up governments. And so there isn't an issue of a lack of female agency in the region.
Absolutely.
The issue, of course, is how the state is responding to calls for change. And unfortunately, if the state is refusing to accept what, for example, the research or the findings of women rights organizations or protests by women in major cities across the region, it comes down to applying adequate pressure, continuing to lobby, continuing to raise awareness online, in schools, so that women are aware of their rights, they're aware of the laws that are in hand, and then hopefully that will pave the way for reforms to be actualized, or for more women to understand that there are certain laws out there that exist out there that can help them. And if they wish to build on that, hopefully through pressure, they can do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, community based approaches are key. Yes, because then it's not just women in the community, it's the entire community, because this is not, as you mentioned earlier, it's not a women's issue, it affects the entire community.
Exactly.
Yasmina Allouche, thank you very much for your time today and for all the work that you do. And we hope to continue our conversation on this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my pleasure.